Today I wanted to talk about speaker crossover upgrades, particularly my set of Bowers and Wilkins 602 S2s that I've had for several years now. Pretty nice speakers. There are a couple things I didn't like about them that this upgrade from Danny at GR Research really took care of. A couple things that were always issues where the tweeters always were a little hot on these guys, and depending on your program material, sometimes the bass wasn't real tight, that it felt a little, hurt a little box resonation there of the cabinet. So I'm not one to mess around with crossovers other than replacing the original components, because I don't want to experiment, because I don't have the equipment to actually see what I'm doing. Years ago I listened to my main speakers were those LX speakers, those LX Pros, that you can check that video out where I did a little bit of upgrade to them. And I had those running with a non-powered subwoofer setup. The box had two JBL rear firing speakers in it, and that was fine for years until I started losing a little bass, and here it was the crossover had some issues on that subwoofer. So rather than work on that, I decided to get another set of speakers, which I'll probably get back to that subwoofer sometime. But I learned a lot throughout this speaker upgrade, because I don't consider myself an audiophile, so a lot of that out there in those parts I always considered a lot of snake oil. But is it? I've learned something, and learned something about higher end quality parts that can make a difference. Now, there are a lot of things that I'm not going to touch, because once you go down that issue with audio, you know very well, as much as most of us do, down that rabbit hole, it can get quite expensive, and I've never had that expense. So it's a matter of setting a goal, drawing a line where you want to be at, and I'm happy where I'm at right now. And rather than purchase another set of speakers, which would have been way more expensive and would I've really liked them, these B&W 602 S2s were late 90s, early 2000 models, and they retailed for around a little bit over $600 for the set back then. That's over $1,000, $1,100 at this point. So what are you going to get that's half decent for that price even nowadays? So it was well worth spending the upgrade, because Danny was the only person that I saw that actually did testing and actually has the proper equipment to test and come up with a solution that actually does an improvement on these speakers. So before I get into that, I've got some notes here, because I always forget things that I want to say. But before we get into that, think about all the audio myths about components and such, and I'm not so sure now after I've done a few things. So I set a goal, and I've been screwing around with audio all my life, never really had the cash to go into it full blown. When I was a teenager, first car I owned, heck, too bad I couldn't patent all my ideas. I invented the first in-dash 8-track tape player in my old car, is it had a plain plastic panel above where the radio sat, and that panel would have been designated for the air conditioning outlets, but that car didn't have it. So I actually put a Kraco 8-track tape player in there, and actually there were two models of those old Kraco 8-track tape players. Their older version had the metal case transistors, and the newer one, which sounded a whole lot better, had the plastic transistors in it. But anyway, as I got older, I picked up a Vega. I laugh at that. So of course that's when we had cassette decks were in, and I cut out the doors, inserted speakers and everything, but I wasn't happy with that. So I came up with my own solution. I took a output board off of another old 8-track tape player, and I had made a custom input and a crossover that just took care of the lows, and I hooked that up to my set of I had a home set of Sylvania two-way speakers, big old boxes back then, and I stuck them in the back deck. So I kind of invented that, I suppose. I don't know, the first amplifier booster, who knows. And as time went on, things improved, and we had the Mind Blower speakers by Tenna. Who remembers those? And I had a set of those in one of my cars once that a friend gave me, and eventually he wanted them back because he got a new car. So someone else gave me a pair that had blown cones in them, and I got to thinking. So I took them apart, and the whole amplifier assembly was on aluminum heatsink, and it just screwed onto the speaker. So I bought a good set of triaxial 6x9s, and I mounted those amplifiers, and everybody used to comment on how good my stereo sounded in my truck. And I had a Blazer, and I had some boxes that those speakers sat in the back that I custom made myself. So there are all kind of things you can do, but generally most of my audio listening is digital from my computer. And for years, you know, I listened to CDs, a lot of MP3s that I ripped, and lossless compression, the free lossless audio codec. And I did find out one thing. There's absolutely no difference on your computer between an MP3 and lossless audio compression in sound, unless, now you know I said that unless, the day that I got a USB DAC, digital audio to digital to analog audio converter, and I discovered that was years ago, and it's a mediocre, and it's not a super high end, but even the quality of the MP3s improved on my amplifiers. And the lossless, there were things there that I never heard before. So it does, little things do make a difference. Now I'll never have an audio room, so there's no use screwing around and buying expensive cables for my speakers, things of that sort, because it's not going to make a difference. If you have a dedicated audio room that the acoustics are set up really well, you're going to notice all these little things that you do. But I'm where I'm at, and is what it is, and I'm happy where I'm at. So let's get back to the speakers here. You know, Danny in his video commented that this upgrade will take the 602s, S2s up to a whole new level. And I think he's correct, because the highs are much clearer and more defined, and the bass is a lot tighter. So I'm glad I did it. But that's, I think, as far as I'm going to go with, you know, that sort of thing. And included in the kit, of course, were all the components. I'm not going to show you the schematic, because that's something that Danny worked and came up with. I'm not going to give you component values, but if you're considering buying this upgrade kit, it's pretty much well worth it, I think, instead of going out and looking for another pair of speakers, especially if you pick up a pair of 602 S2s, you know, relatively cheap. Some people have. I think I paid several years ago $400 for the set of mine, but I've seen guys pick them up at garage sales, at secondhand stores, really cheap. So it'd be worth it to do this upgrade on them as long as they're in good shape. I used all the components except at this point I didn't put the electrotube connectors in, the tube connectors for the input wiring, because one of them was a little loose. It just didn't set right, so I didn't use them but I emailed Danny about it, and it's silly me. Sometimes we overlook the simplest things on how to tighten those up, but I'll put them back in sometime and I'll use them, because the way I did this, it'll be pretty easy to put those in and not use the original binding posts. Also in the kit included solid copper number 18 oxygen free wire. The caps were high quality caps, which I'm learning something. In a crossover, those two make a difference. High quality inductors, the high quality resistors to eliminate the sand cast resistors that was in there, and especially the no res, his dampening material. Now all this stuff works together, so I would think that the improvement is each little thing you do. The better inductors, the better capacitors, the high res dampening material, making a difference over that foam that Bowers and Wilkins put in initially. But here is the this is what the original crossover looked like. You can see the two inductors, and there were actually two capacitors and a sandcast resistor in the original. Now with this upgrade, you're going to eliminate one of the capacitors that's not needed, and I'll show you on the back where I put a jumper across for that one. But pulling the woofer out, you just be careful, because that outside ring will fall off, and if you're down there with your slippers on like me and fell on my toe, ouch. But be careful of those speakers, but they come out reasonably easy. And on the woofer, you can see where I replaced the wiring with the solid wiring, the number 18. And those terminal strips are a little bit sensitive to movement, so you can see where I wire tied the wiring on the back of the speaker there to prevent any movement, is to not damage that terminal post there. The tweeter wire at this point I left alone. I didn't want to pull the tweeter out and solder onto the tweeter connections. As you see, the tweeter has a plug-in connector on it. I actually may replace that later on, that wiring in there, because I have a tool somewhere, I couldn't find it to use those connectors to crimp those on, and if I ever look that up sometime. But in my case, I don't think it's going to make a difference as far as how my listening is and where I'm listening at, because I am, like I said, I'm not high end, a little hi-fi there, that that's about it. Now there are different ways to mount the crossover parts. A lot of guys just make up a wooden board, and some guys make up their own PC board, but I actually used the original PC board that the parts were on, and you can see here how I mounted everything. And everything is glued down so it won't move. The capacitors, the resistors, the inductors are wire tied plus glued down, and you notice how the inductors are facing different directions. It's the same as if you're building a tube amplifier, you want to turn the power transformer a different angle than the output transformers, because depending on the flux, it can interfere. One can interfere with the other. So that's pretty straightforward there. And on the back of the board, you can see where I put that jumper across for the capacitor that came out, and just put a jumper right across the board. And other than that, it's pretty simple. The no res dampening material, there was enough to do the sides and the top. The back and the bottom I used the original. You can see in the two photos here how that fit in real nicely. That stuff has a sticky back on it, so it's kind of nice. You cut it and stick it right in there. You don't have to glue it in. But I used the original piece of foam on the back and a piece in the bottom, since that's what's sitting on my speaker stand, so I figured it wouldn't interfere. But all in all, it came out good. And as I said, the difference, especially in the high end, I think the upgrade was well worth it. And as I said, I'm not going to show you the different schematic of what Danny came up with, because I feel that's his work, but it's well worth it to do the upgrade. And I think I'm going to go back on the LX upgrades, because I'm going to put a little better quality caps on those tweeters, and I think it will make a difference. I never thought that about the capacitors, those expensive caps, you know, a little bit of questionable, because I can never hear the difference. But as you improve things, each little thing adds up, and you start to hear differences. I mean, the soundstage is awesome, because I listen to everything from country, old country, even including old Hank, to newer stuff, to big band, to AC/DC, and everything in between. So I enjoy a lot of different styles of music, old and new. But you hear things that are different, and your ears will pick up. And I'm afraid to listen to a really super high-end system, because I'm going to say, oh man, I'd like to have that, but it's going to cost me, and I'll never do that. So I'm comfortable where I'm at. So if you have any questions, give a yell, and any comments, anything I can help you out with. And if you have any questions about this crossover upgrade, just send an email over to GR Research. They'll get back to you. And actually, if I added up the cost of these components, and I don't think you could buy everything separately for what he's selling the kit for, because they're buying in bulk if you bought everything separately. I don't know where he gets the no res, whether that's his own creation that he has someone making for him, but I'm sure there's other comparable out there. But if you add it all up, I think the cost is going to come in more than what he's selling the kit for. So other than that, it's another beautiful day outside today. Have a good day.